If a headline promises to reveal what the royal family is hiding, I want to be honest with you about something before we even start. There isn't some dramatic secret being covered up here. What there is, though, is a genuinely interesting gap between what's been officially confirmed and what remains deliberately private. And understanding that gap tells you a lot more about how this family actually operates than any conspiracy theory would. So today, we're going through exactly what's known about King Charles's health, what isn't, why that distinction exists, and how it connects to the equally interesting story of Royal Lodge, the mansion Andrew was finally forced out of earlier this year, and what happens to it now. If you want more of this kind of grounded, fact-checked coverage, consider subscribing. Let's get into it. Let's start with the health situation, because it's the foundation for almost everything else happening in this family right now. Charles was diagnosed with an undisclosed form of cancer in February 2024, found incidentally during treatment for a separate, benign, enlarged prostate condition. For roughly 2 years after that, his public schedule was noticeably affected, engagements were adjusted, and there was constant speculation about severity, since the exact cancer type was never named. The real turning point came in December 2025, when Charles delivered a taped message ahead of Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer broadcast recorded at Clarence House. He announced that his schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced heading into the new year, describing it as both a personal blessing and a testament to advances in cancer care. He added that he hoped the news might offer encouragement to the roughly half of people who will face a cancer diagnosis at some point in their lives. Buckingham Palace, notably, did not use the word remission in confirming this, but they did describe his recovery as having reached a genuinely positive stage. Since then, the pattern has held. Charles has kept up a demanding schedule through the first half of 2026, including hosting Nigeria's president for a state visit. And as of this month, he's begun his traditional summer stay at Balmoral, welcomed by a full military arrival ceremony, complete with a guard of honor and the regimental pipes and drums. He's already spent much of August in Scotland, attending the Castle of May Games and visiting a mountain rescue team, keeping a full, active program rather than easing back. One royal correspondent described him as looking forward to a properly family-focused summer after making what's been called great progress with his treatment. That's the confirmed, documented version of where his health stands. Significantly improved, actively managed, but never officially declared remission or cured. So here's the part that gets billed as what they're hiding. The palace has never disclosed the specific type of cancer Charles has. That's true, and it's understandable why some people find that frustrating given how much public interest there is in his health. But it's worth being clear about what that actually is and isn't. It's not evidence of some more serious concealed diagnosis. Royal medical privacy has been standard practice for generations, going back through Queen Elizabeth's own health disclosures, which were similarly limited in specifics, even in her final years. The reasoning the palace has generally given, both formally and through royal commentators, is straightforward. Naming a specific cancer type would open the door to constant public speculation about prognosis, treatment options, and survival statistics. Speculation Charles and his medical team likely feel would do more harm than good, given his continued public role. That's a defensible common medical privacy decision, not a cover-up, even if it does leave room for headlines that frame it as more mysterious than it actually is. It's worth comparing this to how Kate's cancer was handled too, since the two situations unfolded on a similar timeline and offer a useful side-by-side. Kate announced her own diagnosis in March 2024, just weeks after Charles's, and went through around 6 months of preventive chemotherapy before being reported to be in remission roughly a year later. Her specific cancer type was also never disclosed publicly. That consistency across two separate family members handled by presumably different medical teams and different personal circumstances, suggests this is a deliberate institutional approach, rather than something unique to Charles's particular case. It's the kind of pattern that, once you look at it directly, undercuts the idea that there's anything unusual or suspicious about how his diagnosis has been communicated. There's also a practical dimension worth mentioning. Even without a named cancer type, the palace has actually been fairly forthcoming about the trajectory of his treatment. More forthcoming, arguably, than many public figures ever are about their own health. We know roughly when it was found, how it was found, the treatment has been ongoing for over 2 years, and that the treatment schedule has recently been reduced due to positive progress. That's a meaningful amount of real information, even without the one specific detail, the exact diagnosis, that tends to generate the most speculation-driven headlines. Now, let's turn to the other half of this story. Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park that Andrew occupied for over 2 decades before finally being forced out earlier this year. This saga actually goes back much further than most people realize. As far back as September 2024, sources were telling royal reporters that Charles was losing patience with his brother, describing the situation as being at the king's wit's end. Andrew had signed a 75-year lease on the property back in 2003 and had reportedly spent around £7 million on renovations, which gave him a real legal claim to stay, regardless of how much pressure the king applied. For a long stretch, it genuinely looked like Andrew had won that standoff. As recently as August 2025, one royal expert described it as a limited but real victory for Andrew, pointing out his continued occupancy came down to binding lease rights rather than any actual rehabilitation within the family. That changed once new documents and files tied to the Epstein scandal became public, reigniting scrutiny of Andrew's conduct. Charles moved decisively. He formally stripped Andrew of his remaining style, titles, and honors, and cut off both his roughly £1 million annual allowance and the estimated £3 million a year previously spent on his private security. According to a Daily Mail report, things came to a head in early February 2026, when a fresh wave of photographs of Andrew around Windsor apparently pushed Charles past his limit. One insider described the king as having decided enough was enough, and the message was reportedly relayed to Andrew that he needed to leave for Norfolk immediately. Andrew is said to have made the move under cover of darkness on a Monday night, relocating first to Wood Farm Cottage on the Sandringham estate before eventually settling into a longer-term residence at Marsh Farm once renovations there were completed. That's a genuinely dramatic sequence of events when you lay it out. 7-figure allowances cut, security funding pulled, a rushed nighttime departure. But it happened almost entirely without an official palace statement walking through the details. What we know comes from insider sourcing rather than any formal announcement, which is exactly the kind of gap that fuels what they're hiding style headlines, even though the actual explanation is fairly simple. The palace generally doesn't publicly narrate the mechanics of an internal family dispute, even a consequential one, preferring brief formal statements over blow-by-blow accounts. It's worth pausing on just how long this particular standoff actually dragged on, because it says something real about the limits of even a monarch's authority within his own family. Charles first began signaling frustration with the arrangement back in 2024, and it took well over a year, involving cut allowances, cut security funding, and ultimately a very public scandal reigniting around the Epstein files before Andrew actually left. That timeline is a useful reminder that even the king doesn't have unilateral power to simply evict a family member from a property they hold a legitimate binding lease on. Andrew's 75-year lease, signed back in 2003, gave him real legal standing that no amount of family pressure could immediately override. It ultimately took a combination of financial pressure, reputational catastrophe, and what by all accounts was a genuine personal breaking point for Charles before the situation actually resolved. That's a much slower, messier process than the phrase "King Charles evicts Andrew" tends to suggest, and understanding that timeline helps explain why Royal Lodge's future is still unresolved months later. Decisions like this simply don't move quickly inside an institution built around legal precedent, formal process, and careful public messaging. So what happens to Royal Lodge now that it's sitting empty? This is genuinely still an open question, and it's worth being clear about what's confirmed versus what's speculation. What's confirmed is that the property requires immense annual upkeep, reportedly running into the millions, and that it's now sitting vacant after Andrew's departure. Beyond that, we're mostly in speculation territory. Some reporting has suggested Charles is exploring turning the property into a commercial asset, potentially renting it out for as much as £1 million a year, which would help offset those maintenance costs rather than leaving the Crown estate to absorb them indefinitely. There have also been unconfirmed reports, sourced to a single royal newsletter, suggesting Charles floated the idea of offering Royal Lodge to Harry and Meghan as a kind of goodwill gesture. That report describes it explicitly as an idea being floated rather than anything decided, with even the source acknowledging the optics would be tricky, given how tied the property has become to the Andrew scandal. Given everything we've covered about the slow, careful nature of Charles's reconciliation efforts with Harry, a move that dramatic, handing over Andrew's old home, would be a significant departure from the cautious, incremental approach we've seen so far. So it's worth treating this particular rumor with real skepticism until there's something more solid behind it. There's also been talk that Charles originally hoped to give Royal Lodge to William and Kate, but the couple has reportedly settled happily into their own new residence, often described as their forever home, and isn't interested in relocating. That leaves the commercial rental option looking like the most plausible near-term outcome, though nothing has been formally announced. It's worth noting how unusual it actually is for a former senior royal residence to sit empty and undecided for this long. Windsor Great Park properties of this scale don't typically stay vacant. They're usually reassigned fairly quickly to another family member or repurposed for institutional use. The fact that Royal Lodge has remained in limbo for months now says something about just how complicated the Andrew situation has made even the practical, unglamorous business of property management within the family. Every option on the table carries its own baggage. Renting it commercially means the Crown estate effectively profiting from a house steeped in recent scandal. Offering it to Harry and Meghan means permanently associating them with Andrew's fall from grace. And leaving it empty means continuing to absorb enormous maintenance costs for a property nobody currently wants to be publicly linked to. That's likely part of why no decision has been announced yet. Every realistic option comes with real reputational trade-offs attached. Quick break. If you're finding this kind of grounded, fact-checked royal coverage useful, let me know in the comments whether you'd rather see a deep dive specifically on the Andrew Epstein investigation or more on what's next for Royal Lodge. And I'll prioritize whichever one you want to see covered next. Either way, I'll keep sourcing this the same way, real reporting first, speculation clearly labeled as speculation. Now, let's address one more piece of speculation that's been circulating, because it ties directly into the "what they're hiding" framing a lot of headlines lean on. Claims that Prince William could become king within roughly a year. This claim traces back to a single royal commentator, speaking on a podcast, who described sourcing this from unnamed contacts inside the palace. It's worth being genuinely skeptical of this one specifically. The same commentator has openly discussed having been paid as a publicist by a member of the extended royal circle in the past, which raises real questions about how independent that sourcing actually is, and no other outlet, mainstream or otherwise, has corroborated a specific timeline like that. Given everything we've actually confirmed, that Charles has kept up an active, expanding public schedule this year, that his doctors are reportedly pleased with his progress, and that there's been no formal indication from the palace of any change to his role, a confident claim about an imminent transition doesn't hold up well against the documented facts. It's the kind of speculative claim that's easy to package as an exclusive bombshell, but it simply isn't supported by what's actually been verified. That's really the through line of this entire video. There's a real difference between information that's deliberately private, like the specific nature of Charles's cancer, which reflects a defensible and pretty standard medical privacy decision, and speculation dressed up as insider knowledge, like the William succession claim, which doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Understanding that difference is genuinely useful if you want to follow this family's story accurately, rather than getting swept up in whatever framing generates the most clicks that week. It's a distinction worth applying broadly, honestly, to how you consume royal news in general. There's a meaningful difference between a fact that's confirmed by an official statement, a fact that's reported by multiple independent outlets citing separate sources, and a claim that traces back to a single commentator with a financial history tied to the family they're reporting on. All three tend to get presented with the same confident tone online, but they don't deserve the same level of trust. The Royal Lodge rental idea, for instance, sits somewhere in the middle, plausible, consistent with the King's stated interest in reducing maintenance costs, but still not formally confirmed. The Harry and Meghan move-in idea sits lower on that scale, a single source floating a hypothetical. And the William succession claim sits at the bottom, one commentator's account with an obvious potential conflict of interest and zero independent corroboration. Learning to sort stories into those tiers is probably the single most useful habit you can build as a royal news viewer. That habit becomes even more valuable when you consider how these stories often compound on each other. A speculative claim about succession gets picked up by a second outlet without re-verifying the original source, gets summarized into a punchier headline by a third, and by the time it reaches a video thumbnail or social media post, it's been presented as established fact 3 or 4 times removed from a single questionable original claim. That's not unique to royal reporting. It's a pattern across most celebrity and political coverage online. But the royal family's mix of genuine institutional secrecy around some things, like medical specifics, and heavy media appetite for literally everything else, makes it a particularly good case study in how to actually evaluate what you're reading rather than just reacting to how confidently it's presented. So where do things actually stand as we head into the rest of 2026? Charles remains an active, working monarch with a genuinely improved health outlook, even if the full clinical picture was never going to be made public in detail. Royal Lodge sits empty, its future still undecided between a commercial rental plan and unconfirmed rumors about a Sussex family move-in. Andrew continues his quiet, isolated life in Norfolk, having already turned down at least one recent olive branch from his brother. And any claims about an imminent change in the monarchy itself remain unsupported speculation rather than anything close to confirmed. If any of that changes, a formal health update, an actual decision on Royal Lodge, or real movement on succession, I'll be covering it here, so make sure you're subscribed for that. And if you missed our earlier breakdown of exactly how the Andrew situation unfolded from the beginning, titles, eviction, and everything that followed, I covered that in full detail in another video. You can check it out by clicking right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Developing.